Before we go any further, I want you to pause for a moment and look around you. Really look. The room you are sitting in, the walls, the furniture, the device you are holding, the light above your head. Everything feels solid. Everything looks permanent, as if it has always been here. But what if I told you that none of these things began as physical objects? Not one of them started as something you could touch. Every single thing you see around you began somewhere else first. It began in a place you cannot see. It began in the invisible workshop of the human mind. This idea may sound simple at first, but once you truly understand it, the way you look at reality will never be the same again. Because every building you pass on the street was once nothing more than a thought in someone's imagination. Every invention that changed the world started as an idea no one else could see. The airplane was once an impossible dream in the minds of two brothers staring up at the sky. The computer was once a strange concept that existed only in sketches and theories. Even the phone in your hand began as a quiet idea inside someone's mind, long before it became a physical device. The pattern is always the same. First comes the idea. Then comes the imagination that shapes the idea. After that comes belief, effort, and action. Only at the very end does the physical object appear in the world. The visible reality you see is always the final chapter of a story that began invisibly. This means something extraordinary is happening all around us every day. Though most people never notice it, there is a hidden stage behind the scenes of reality where creation quietly begins. It is a place where ideas are born, where possibilities are explored, and where futures are imagined before they ever take shape in the physical world. That place is not a factory, a laboratory, or a distant location. It is the human mind. Your mind is not simply a place where thoughts drift randomly from one moment to the next. It is a creative environment. It is a workshop where images, ideas, and possibilities are constantly being formed. Some of these ideas fade away quickly, like sketches that are erased before they are finished, but others grow stronger. They are repeated, explored, and developed until they begin influencing the world outside the mind. Think about how often you use this workshop without realizing it. Every time you plan something, you are imagining a future event before it happens. Every time you solve a problem, you are visualizing different possibilities before choosing a solution. Even when you worry about something, you are using imagination to picture a scenario that does not yet exist. The mind is constantly creating internal images of what might happen next. Some of those images inspire confidence and possibility. Others generate doubt and fear. Yet regardless of their nature, they all originate in the same invisible workshop. Now here is where things become truly interesting. The physical world you experience often begins responding to the patterns created inside that workshop. When an idea is repeated often enough, it begins shaping attention and behavior. The mind starts noticing opportunities related to that idea. It begins exploring ways to bring the idea into reality. Consider an architect standing in front of an empty piece of land. To everyone else, it is simply an empty space. But inside the architect's mind, the building already exists. They can see the structure rising into the sky. They can imagine the hallways, the windows, the flow of light through the rooms. In their imagination, the future building is already real. The construction process simply turns that invisible vision into physical form. This process is not limited to architecture or invention. It operates quietly in every human life. The ideas you repeat about yourself slowly become the framework through which you experience the world. If you repeatedly imagine limitations, the mind begins expecting obstacles. If you repeatedly imagine growth and possibility, the mind begins searching for paths forward. Most people believe their circumstances create their thoughts. They think the world outside determines how they feel and what they believe about their future. But if you look carefully at how creation works, you begin to notice something different. Often the internal image appears first, and the external result follows later. The mind forms a picture of what seems possible. That picture influences behavior, decisions, and persistence. Over time, those actions gradually shape the environment around the person. The invisible image becomes the blueprint from which reality begins to grow. This does not mean that imagination instantly changes the world the moment you think of something. Creation is usually a gradual process. Ideas must be explored, developed, and supported by effort. But every creation begins with the same invisible spark. Without the idea, the action would never begin. Once you recognize the existence of this invisible workshop, something important begins to shift in the way you see your own mind. Your thoughts are no longer random background noise. They become the early stages of creation. The images you hold inside your imagination begin to matter more than you may have realized. Every day, countless ideas pass through your mind. Some disappear immediately. Others return again and again. The ones you repeat begin shaping the direction of your attention and behavior. They slowly become the seeds from which future experiences grow. And this realization leads to a question that most people rarely ask themselves. If every physical creation begins as an idea, and if the mind is constantly generating ideas about the future, then what kinds of ideas are you planting inside that invisible workshop right now? Because long before reality changes on the outside, something has already begun changing inside the mind. And once an idea becomes clear enough in that hidden workshop, the world eventually finds a way to build around it. I want you to notice something simple, something so obvious that most people never stop to think about it. Every physical object you see in the world today once existed only as an idea, before it was built, before it was manufactured, before anyone could touch it. It first appeared inside the mind of someone who imagined it. The chair you sit on, the building outside your window, the car passing down the street, the device in your hand. None of these things began in the physical world. They began as invisible thoughts. This may seem like a small observation, but if you truly understand it, it changes the way you see reality, because it means the visible world is not the beginning of creation. It is the final stage. The real beginning happens somewhere much quieter and much less visible. It happens inside imagination. Think about the simplest example. Before someone builds a house, they first imagine it. They picture the structure in their mind. They see where the doors will be, how the rooms will connect, where the windows will allow light to enter. Long before the first brick is laid, the house already exists in a mental form. The blueprint is simply the translation of that invisible idea into a plan that others can follow. In other words, the physical house is not the original creation. The idea of the house is the same pattern appears everywhere once you start paying attention. Every invention in history followed this exact sequence. First, there was an idea that existed only in someone's imagination. Then that idea was explored, refined, and developed. Eventually, it became something physical that others could see and use. But the origin was always invisible. Even the great technological advances that transformed civilization began as fragile ideas that many people initially dismissed. When the idea of flying machines first appeared, it seemed ridiculous. The thought that humans could travel through the air like birds sounded impossible. Yet somewhere in the mind of the Wright brothers, that idea did not appear impossible. It appeared fascinating. They imagined the possibility long enough to begin experimenting with it. What the world now recognizes as the airplane was once nothing more than a vision held inside a pair of determined minds. The same is true for every creative achievement. Writers imagine stories before they exist on paper. Artists see images in their minds before the brush ever touches the canvas. Musicians hear melodies internally before they become sound. The physical expression always follows the invisible conception. Once you begin to recognize this pattern, you realize something important about the mind. It is not merely a place where you observe reality. It is a place where reality quietly begins. Most people underestimate the role their inner life plays in shaping their outer experiences. They believe that circumstances determine their thoughts. They think the world outside tells them what is possible. But when you study the process of creation carefully, you discover that the direction often flows the other way. Ideas appear first. Those ideas influence what people attempt, what they believe is achievable, and how persistently they pursue their goals. The internal image becomes a kind of compass guiding behavior. Imagine two people standing in front of the same opportunity. One person sees possibility, the other sees risk and limitation. They are looking at the same situation, yet their reactions are completely different. Why? Because their internal ideas about what is possible are different. One mind has accepted a vision of success, the other has accepted a vision of difficulty. Those invisible ideas begin shaping what each person does next. The one who imagines success may take action, experiment, and persist through challenges. The one who imagines failure may hesitate or withdraw before even trying. Over time, the results begin reflecting those internal expectations. This is why ideas are more powerful than they initially appear. They are not just abstract thoughts floating through the mind. They act like seeds. Once planted and repeated often enough, they begin influencing perception, attention, and behavior. The mind starts organizing experiences around the ideas it accepts as meaningful. But here is something even more interesting. Many of the ideas shaping your life today were not consciously chosen. They developed gradually through past experiences, cultural messages, and repeated thoughts. Over time, they became assumptions about what you believe is possible for you. Some of those assumptions may encourage growth and exploration. Others may quietly limit what you attempt. Yet both types operate in the same way. They influence the invisible stage where ideas are formed. The good news is that ideas are not fixed structures. They can evolve. The mind is capable of generating new possibilities at any moment. When someone begins imagining a different future for themselves, they introduce a new concept into that invisible workshop of creation. At first, the new idea may feel unfamiliar. It may even seem unrealistic compared to older beliefs. But if the person continues returning to the idea, exploring it, and imagining its possibilities, something begins to change. The mind gradually becomes more comfortable with the vision. As that internal image becomes clearer, it begins influencing the choices and actions that follow. What once seemed impossible slowly begins appearing attainable. This is how many transformations in life begin, not with dramatic external events, but with a quiet shift in the ideas someone is willing to entertain inside their mind. The moment you recognize that every physical reality begins as an idea, you start seeing your own thoughts differently. They are no longer insignificant mental chatter. They are the early sketches of potential futures. Some of those sketches will fade away. Others will grow stronger depending on how often you revisit them and how deeply you explore them. The mind naturally develops the ideas it returns to most often, so the question becomes very personal. If every physical creation begins as an idea, then the ideas you consistently imagine today may be shaping the experiences you encounter tomorrow. And once you truly understand that principle, something remarkable becomes clear. The future does not begin in the outside world. It begins in the quiet moment when a single idea first appears in your mind and you decide to keep it there. Now, I want you to consider a statement that has echoed through spiritual traditions for thousands of years. It is a sentence so familiar that many people have heard it countless times without ever pausing to examine its deeper meaning. The statement is simple. Humanity was made in the image of the Creator. Most people interpret this idea in a literal or symbolic way. Imagining it refers to appearance or moral character. But if you look more closely, a deeper interpretation begins to appear, one that changes the way you understand your own mind. To be made in the image of a creator does not necessarily mean sharing the same physical form. It means sharing the same creative nature. It suggests that the essential quality of the creator is also present within the human being. And what is the defining quality of a creator? The ability to bring something into existence that did not previously exist. When you examine the human mind, you begin to see that this creative ability is present in a remarkable way. Unlike other living creatures, humans possess the ability to imagine possibilities that are not yet part of their environment. You can picture a future event that has not happened. You can design inventions that have never existed before. You can create stories, art, and ideas that transform the way people understand the world. This ability to imagine is more than just a mental curiosity. It is one of the most powerful forces shaping human history. Entire civilizations have been built upon ideas that first appeared inside someone's imagination. Cities rise, technologies develop, and cultures evolve because human beings possess the ability to envision something different from what currently exists. In this sense, imagination is not merely entertainment for the mind. It is the tool through which creation begins. It is the faculty that allows an invisible idea to eventually take form in the visible world. If you reflect on your own life, you will notice how often this creative ability appears. Every decision you make about the future begins with an imagined possibility. When you plan a project, you picture the outcome before the work begins. When you set a goal, you visualize a version of yourself that does not yet exist. Even when you worry about the future, you are using imagination to construct scenarios that have not yet happened. Your mind is constantly generating internal images of what could be. Sometimes those images inspire growth and courage. Other times they produce hesitation or doubt. But in every case, the same creative faculty is operating. This realization invites a new way of thinking about what it means to be made in the image of a creator. It suggests that the creative power shaping the universe may also be expressed through human imagination, not in the sense of controlling every event, but in the sense of participating in the ongoing process of creation. Think about how a sculptor approaches a block of stone. To someone else, the stone appears ordinary and unremarkable, but to the sculptor, the finished form already exists inside their imagination. They can see the shape hidden within the stone long before anyone else recognizes it. The sculptor's task is simply to remove the material that prevents the imagined form from appearing. In a similar way, imagination allows you to perceive possibilities hidden within the circumstances of your life, where others may see limitations. Imagination may reveal opportunity, where others see uncertainty. Imagination may reveal direction. However, many people gradually lose confidence in this creative ability as they grow older. Early in life, imagination flows freely. Children invent worlds, create stories, and explore possibilities without hesitation. But over time, social expectations and past experiences can narrow the boundaries of what people believe is possible. Imagination becomes something reserved for entertainment rather than a tool for shaping the future. Yet the creative capacity itself never disappears. It remains present in every human mind, waiting to be used intentionally rather than accidentally. When someone reconnects with this inner creative ability, something important begins to shift. They start recognizing that their internal images influence how they approach life. Instead of reacting only to circumstances, they begin exploring the possibilities that imagination reveals. This does not mean ignoring reality or pretending difficulties do not exist. Rather, it means understanding that the mind can hold a vision of something better even while working through present challenges. That vision acts as a guiding force, shaping choices and actions over time. Many of the individuals who transform the world possessed this ability to imagine a different reality long before others believed it was achievable. They held on to ideas that initially seemed unrealistic, but by continuing to develop those ideas, they eventually turned imagination into innovation. The same principle applies on a personal level. The version of yourself you become is often influenced by the images you hold about your own potential. If you repeatedly imagine growth, learning, and possibility, the mind begins aligning your attention and behavior toward those outcomes. If you repeatedly imagine limitation, the mind begins reinforcing those expectations as well. This is why the concept of being made in the image of a creator carries such powerful implications. It suggests that imagination is not a trivial activity. It is part of the creative nature embedded within the human mind. You are not merely an observer of reality. In many ways, you are a participant in the process through which reality develops. And the moment you begin recognizing the creative ability operating inside your own imagination, you start to see your thoughts in a new light. They are no longer random mental events passing through your awareness. They are the early expressions of a creative power that has been present within you all along. The real question, then, is not whether you possess this creative capacity. You already do. The deeper question is whether you are using it consciously or allowing it to operate unnoticed while it quietly shapes the direction of your life. Up to this point, I have been asking you to look carefully at something most people overlook. First, we explored the invisible workshop where creation begins. Then we saw that every physical thing starts as an idea. After that, we examined the ancient claim that human beings are made in the image of the Creator. Now we arrive at a question that sits quietly beneath all of these ideas. If we truly possess a creative nature, then what is the instrument through which that creativity operates? The answer is closer than you think. It is something you have used thousands of times, often without even realizing it. It is the faculty that allows you to see something that is not physically present. It is the ability to picture a future before it exists. That faculty is imagination. Most people treat imagination as something playful or optional. They associate it with daydreaming, storytelling, or childhood creativity. But what if imagination is not merely entertainment for the mind? What if it is the very mechanism through which creation begins? Think about the way imagination works. When you imagine something vividly, the mind temporarily experiences it as though it were real. Your brain responds to imagined situations in ways that are surprisingly similar to how it responds to real events. Athletes, musicians, and performers have discovered this through years of practice. When they mentally rehearse a performance with enough clarity and emotional engagement, their bodies begin preparing for the experience even before it happens. In other words, imagination is not passive observation. It is participation in a possible reality. This is why imagination has always played a central role in human progress. Every invention, every artistic masterpiece, every new discovery began with someone imagining something that did not yet exist. The imagination reached beyond present circumstances and formed a picture of a different possibility. That picture became the guiding force behind action. But the role of imagination goes deeper than practical creativity. Throughout spiritual history, imagination has often been described as a sacred power. Many thinkers and mystics have suggested that the ability to imagine is not just a human convenience, but a reflection of the creative intelligence that shapes the universe itself. Consider this idea carefully. If the universe is constantly unfolding through creative processes, and if human beings possess the ability to generate new ideas and possibilities through imagination, then imagination may be the point where human consciousness participates in the broader act of creation. This does not mean that imagination instantly alters the physical world without effort or time. Creation in the physical realm still requires action, learning, and persistence. But imagination is the starting point. It is where the direction of creation is chosen. Think of imagination as the architect of experience. Before anything changes on the outside, the design appears internally. The mind sketches the blueprint of possibility long before the structure appears in reality. Now imagine living your life without using imagination intentionally. In that case, your internal images would simply reflect whatever circumstances surround you. Your expectations about the future would be limited by what you currently see. The mind would become a mirror rather than a creator. But when imagination is used deliberately, something different begins to happen. The mind stops copying the present and begins exploring the future. Instead of reacting only to circumstances, you start asking a different question. What could exist here that does not exist yet? This shift changes the relationship between you and your environment. You are no longer simply responding to the world as it appears. You are participating in the ongoing process of shaping what may appear next. However, there is an important detail many people miss. Imagination is always active, whether you direct it or not. Even when you believe you are being realistic or practical, the mind is still forming images about what you expect to happen. When someone constantly imagines failure, rejection, or disappointment, they are using imagination just as powerfully as someone who imagines growth and opportunity. The difference lies not in the presence of imagination, but in the direction it takes. This means imagination can quietly shape your experiences even when you are unaware of it. The images you repeatedly hold inside your mind gradually influence how you interpret situations, how you respond to challenges, and how confidently you pursue your goals. Over time, those patterns of thought begin guiding your actions, and actions, repeated consistently, begin shaping the environment around you. This is why imagination has often been called a divine creative power, not because it replaces action or overrides reality, but because it determines the direction in which creative energy flows. It is the place where possibilities are first allowed to exist. Every great transformation begins the same way. Someone dares to imagine something different. They hold the image long enough for it to become clear. Then they begin moving toward that vision, step by step. Without imagination, progress would stop. The world would remain frozen in whatever form it currently holds. But imagination opens the door to new realities. So when you begin to understand imagination in this way, it stops being a casual mental activity. It becomes something far more important. It becomes the instrument through which your creative nature expresses itself. And the moment you recognize that imagination is quietly shaping the direction of your life, a new responsibility appears. Because the images you consistently hold in your mind are not just harmless thoughts passing through your awareness. They are the first outlines of the future you may eventually step into. At this point, you might be thinking something very reasonable. If imagination is such a powerful creative force, then why do so many people imagine wonderful things that never appear in their lives? Why do countless dreams remain dreams? Why do some people imagine success for years without seeing any real change? This question reveals one of the most important distinctions you must understand if you want to grasp how imagination truly works. There is a profound difference between a dreamer and a creator. At first glance, they may look the same. Both use imagination. Both think about possibilities. Both picture a different future. But the inner attitude behind their imagination is completely different. And that difference changes everything. A dreamer imagines from a distance. A creator imagines from participation. Let me explain what I mean by that. A dreamer often treats imagination like a spectator watching a movie. They picture the life they would love to have. They imagine success, freedom, recognition, or happiness. But while imagining it, they quietly remain aware that it belongs to someone else. Somewhere else, in some distant future. The dream feels beautiful, but it also feels separate from their present identity. In other words, the dreamer imagines what they wish could happen, but deep inside they still feel like an observer of that possibility rather than the owner of it. A creator approaches imagination in a completely different way. Instead of observing the desired life from the outside, they mentally step inside the experience. They imagine the situation as though they are already part of it. The image is not a distant fantasy. It is a lived inner experience. When a creator imagines success, they do not see themselves watching it happen. They imagine themselves living it. They feel the perspective of the person who has already arrived there. This subtle difference may appear small, but psychologically it is enormous. The dreamer remains separate from the imagined future. The creator mentally occupies it. Think about the way actors prepare for a role. A beginner may simply memorize the lines of a character. They repeat the words and follow the script. But something about the performance feels artificial. The actor is still standing outside the character. They are pretending, but a skilled actor does something different. They imagine the inner life of the character so vividly that they begin thinking and reacting as that person would. For the duration of the performance, they step into the identity they are portraying. The audience no longer sees someone acting. They see someone being. Creation works in a similar way. The mind responds very differently when you imagine something as a distant possibility versus when you imagine it as a present identity. Dreamers often return again and again to the same images of success while quietly reinforcing the idea that it has not happened yet. They think, "One day this will be my life." But that phrase, "one day," keeps the vision permanently locked in the future. Creators do something unusual. They imagine the end of the story as if they are already standing inside it. They explore what it would feel like to live in that reality now. They allow their imagination to adopt the perspective of the person who has already become what they want to become. When you imagine from that position, something interesting begins happening inside the mind. The image no longer feels like a distant dream. It begins feeling like a potential identity. And identity is one of the most powerful forces guiding human behavior. When someone truly believes they are becoming a certain type of person, their choices begin aligning with that belief. They start acting in ways consistent with the identity they have accepted. Their attention shifts toward opportunities that support it. Their persistence increases because the goal is no longer just something they want, it is something they see as part of who they are. This is the point where imagination stops being entertainment and begins becoming creative power. Most people remain dreamers because they never move beyond the stage of observing their desires. They admire the possibility of a different life, but never mentally step into it. The vision remains external. Creators, on the other hand, treat imagination as a rehearsal of identity. They repeatedly return to the inner experience of already being the person they wish to become. The mind gradually becomes familiar with that perspective. Over time, this familiarity changes the way the individual approaches life. Decisions that once felt intimidating begin to feel natural. Opportunities that once seemed unreachable start appearing more approachable. The person begins behaving differently because their internal reference point has shifted. This does not mean creators avoid challenges. In fact, they often face the same obstacles everyone else does. But their relationship with those obstacles changes. Instead of seeing difficulties as proof that the dream is unrealistic, they see them as temporary steps within a larger vision. The creator continues acting in harmony with the identity they have accepted internally. That is why some individuals eventually turn ideas into reality, while others remain stuck admiring possibilities from afar. The difference is not intelligence, luck, or even resources. The difference often lies in how imagination is used. Dreamers admire a future, creators inhabit it. And once you begin understanding that difference, you may notice something surprising about your own imagination. The question is no longer whether you have dreams. Everyone does. The real question is far more interesting. When you imagine the life you desire, are you standing outside the picture, or are you already standing inside it? Up to this point, we have talked about imagination, ideas, and the difference between dreamers and creators, but now we arrive at something that often confuses people when they first encounter these ideas. It is the subject of faith. The word faith has been used in spiritual teachings for centuries, yet many people misunderstand what it actually means. They assume faith is simply believing something without evidence, or hoping that things will work out somehow. But the kind of faith we are talking about here is not passive belief. It is not wishful thinking. True faith is an inner action. Let me explain what that means. Most people think action only happens in the physical world. They think action means moving your body, doing tasks, building things, or speaking words. And of course, those things matter. But before any physical action takes place, something else happens first. There is a mental action. A decision forms. An idea becomes accepted. An inner movement occurs within the mind. This inner movement is where faith begins. Faith is the willingness to internally accept something as real before it becomes visible. It is the decision to occupy a state in your imagination before the physical world reflects it. In other words, faith is not waiting for evidence. Faith is acting inwardly as if the desired outcome is already part of your life. This idea may feel unfamiliar at first, because we are usually trained to do the opposite. Most people believe they must first see evidence before they allow themselves to believe something is possible. They wait for circumstances to change before adjusting their expectations. Their faith follows the physical world, but when you look closely at how creation actually unfolds, the order is often reversed. The internal state comes first. The external evidence appears later. Think about an entrepreneur who decides to build a new company. At the beginning, there may be no profits, no recognition, and no clear proof that the idea will succeed. If the entrepreneur waited for evidence before believing in the project, nothing would ever begin. Instead, they act from an inner conviction that the idea has potential. That inner conviction motivates the actions that eventually create visible results. The same pattern appears in almost every meaningful accomplishment. Athletes train for years before winning championships. Scientists explore theories long before experiments confirm them. Artists work on ideas long before the public recognizes their value. In every case, an inner commitment appears before the external reward. That commitment is a form of faith. But here is where the idea becomes even more interesting. Faith is not only about believing something will happen in the future. In the deeper sense we are exploring, faith involves mentally experiencing the end result as though it already exists. This is the inner action I mentioned earlier. Imagine someone who wants to become a confident speaker. They could spend years telling themselves they are not ready, waiting for some external moment of certainty. Or they could begin practicing a different internal state. They could imagine themselves speaking clearly, confidently, and calmly in front of others. They could rehearse the experience mentally until it begins feeling familiar. That inner rehearsal is not just fantasy. It is preparation. It is the mind stepping into the role it intends to express. When you repeatedly imagine a desired state and allow yourself to feel it internally, something begins changing within your perception of what is possible. The unfamiliar becomes familiar. The distant becomes approachable. This is why inner action is so important. Without it, imagination remains weak and inconsistent. You may briefly picture what you want, but the image fades quickly because it never becomes a lived experience in the mind. Faith, however, sustains the image. Faith returns to the vision again and again until it becomes natural. It is the quiet persistence of occupying the state you wish to experience. Even when circumstances have not yet changed, faith continues rehearsing the new reality internally. Now, this does not mean ignoring the physical world or pretending challenges do not exist. Reality still requires effort, learning, and practical steps. But those actions become far more effective when they are guided by a clear inner state. Without inner action, physical effort often becomes scattered and uncertain. With inner action, physical behavior begins aligning with the identity you have accepted in imagination. You start thinking differently. You respond to opportunities differently. Even your posture, tone, and decisions begin reflecting the state you have mentally rehearsed. Gradually, the external world begins responding to that shift. This process rarely happens overnight. Creation usually unfolds step by step, but the direction is set the moment the inner action begins. And this brings us to an important realization about faith that many people overlook. Faith is not a feeling that randomly appears when things are going well. It is a choice. It is something you practice within your imagination. Each time you return to the vision of what you want to experience and allow yourself to feel it as real, you are performing an inner action. You are strengthening the mental pattern that will guide your behavior and perception. Over time, this pattern becomes familiar enough that it begins shaping your everyday life. So when people say faith moves mountains, they are not describing a magical event. They are describing the quiet power of inner action, the willingness to accept a new reality in your imagination, long before the world confirms it. And the moment you understand that faith is not passive belief but deliberate inner participation, you realize something powerful. The future you hope to experience does not begin without a movement. It begins with the inner action you are willing to take today. There is a passage that appears in many ancient teachings that speaks about the eye, not the physical eye that allows you to see the world around you, but another kind of seeing that happens inside the mind. It suggests that the way you see internally has the power to influence the direction of your life. Most people read these words symbolically and move on, but if you examine your own experience carefully, you will notice something remarkable. You possess two ways of seeing. One belongs to the body, and the other belongs to the mind. The physical eyes show you what already exists. They reveal the present moment, the current circumstances, the world as it appears right now. But the mind has another kind of vision. It can see things that are not yet physically present. It can picture possibilities that do not exist in front of you. This inner sight is what we call imagination, and it acts like a second set of eyes, an invisible eye of the mind. You use this inner eye constantly, whether you realize it or not. When you remember a past experience, you are seeing through it. You recreate scenes in your mind as though you are watching them again. When you plan something in the future, you picture how it might unfold. You see yourself in situations that have not yet happened. Even when you worry, you are using this same inner vision to imagine outcomes you hope to avoid. The mind is always seeing something, but here is the part most people never stop to consider. The images seen by the inner eye often influence your behavior more strongly than the images seen by the physical eye. What you imagine can affect how you feel, how you act, and what you believe is possible. Think about a moment when you felt nervous about something that had not yet happened. Perhaps you were about to give a presentation, take an exam, or have an important conversation. Your physical surroundings might have been calm and ordinary, yet your imagination created a vivid picture of what could go wrong. That imagined picture produced real emotions in your body. Your heart rate changed, your muscles tightened, and your attention focused on the imagined outcome. In that moment, the inner eye shaped your experience more powerfully than the physical world around you. Now consider the opposite situation. Imagine someone preparing for a challenge with confidence. Before stepping into the situation, they picture themselves handling it successfully. They imagine speaking clearly, acting calmly, and responding effectively. That mental image begins influencing their posture, tone of voice, and decisions. The internal vision guides their external behavior. Again, the eye of the mind becomes the driving force behind the experience. This is why the direction of your inner vision matters so much. If the images you repeatedly see in your imagination are filled with doubt, fear, and limitation, those images quietly shape the way you approach life. The mind begins expecting difficulty. Your behavior adjusts accordingly. But if the inner eye begins seeing possibility, progress, and capability, a different pattern emerges. The mind starts searching for opportunities instead of obstacles. Your attention shifts toward solutions rather than problems. Over time, these patterns of inner vision begin influencing the trajectory of your life. The remarkable thing is that you have more influence over the eye of the mind than you may realize. While you cannot control every circumstance around you, you can choose the images you allow your imagination to explore. You can decide what kinds of possibilities your mind rehearses. This does not mean forcing yourself to ignore reality. The physical world still provides valuable information. But the inner eye gives you something equally important: the ability to imagine a reality that has not yet appeared. Every major step forward in human history began with someone seeing something internally that others could not yet see externally. The inventor sees a machine before it exists. The artist sees a masterpiece before the first brushstroke. The leader sees a future that has not yet taken shape. Their inner vision guides their actions until the external world gradually catches up. In your own life, the same principle quietly operates every day. The pictures you hold in your imagination influence the direction of your energy and attention. They shape how you interpret opportunities, how you respond to challenges, and how persistent you remain when progress seems slow. That is why learning to guide the eye of the mind is such an important skill. Instead of allowing imagination to wander randomly through fears and uncertainties, you can train it to explore constructive possibilities. You can deliberately imagine the qualities you wish to develop, the achievements you want to experience, and the kind of life you want to create. When you repeatedly return to those images, they begin becoming familiar. The mind gradually accepts them as plausible realities rather than distant fantasies. Your behavior begins aligning with the direction those images suggest. Over time, the internal vision starts influencing the external results. This process is subtle, and it rarely happens all at once. But step by step, the pictures you hold inside your imagination begin shaping the choices you make and the paths you pursue. So when ancient teachings speak about the eye that guides the whole body, they are pointing to something very practical. They are reminding you that the direction of your inner vision quietly determines the direction of your life. Because long before the world changes around you, something much more important changes within you. The moment you decide what the eye of your mind will continue looking at, there is a simple principle that quietly appears in the lives of almost every person who accomplishes something meaningful. It is not always spoken about directly, yet it shows up again and again in the stories of creators, inventors, leaders, and visionaries. Before the result becomes visible, they see the end in their mind. Long before circumstances confirm anything, they hold a clear picture of the finished outcome. In other words, they learn to see the end before it exists. Now I want you to think carefully about this idea, because it changes the way most people approach their goals. The average person moves through life by looking only at what is currently happening. They study the present conditions and then try to predict the future based on what they see right now. If circumstances appear difficult, they assume the future will also be difficult. If opportunities seem limited, they assume their options are limited as well. But the individuals who transform their lives rarely operate this way. Instead of letting present circumstances define the future, they allow a future vision to guide their present actions. Imagine an architect standing on an empty piece of land. To everyone else, the ground looks ordinary and unfinished. There is nothing there but open space. But in the architect's mind, the project is already complete. They can see the finished building, They know how the structure will look when the work is done. They understand how people will move through the space and how the design will function. The construction process simply follows the vision that already exists in the mind. This is what it means to see the end before it exists. It is the ability to mentally step into the finished result while the physical world is still in the early stages of change. Now, this idea might seem strange at first, because we are usually trained to think in the opposite direction. We are taught to analyze problems, evaluate obstacles, and carefully measure what seems realistic. And while practical thinking certainly has its place, it often keeps people trapped in the limitations of the present moment. When you look only at what exists right now, you are always reacting to circumstances rather than shaping them. But when you begin with the end in mind, your imagination provides a direction that the present moment cannot yet reveal. Think about an athlete preparing for a competition. Before stepping into the event, they often spend time visualizing the outcome they want to achieve. They imagine crossing the finish line, completing the movement perfectly, or executing their strategy with confidence. They rehearse the victory internally long before the competition begins. This mental rehearsal is not just motivational thinking. It actually prepares the mind and body for the experience. The athlete becomes familiar with success before it physically occurs. The same pattern appears in many areas of life. Entrepreneurs imagine successful companies before those businesses become profitable. Writers imagine finished books before the first chapter is complete. Leaders imagine future possibilities before the path toward them becomes clear. In every case, the end is mentally experienced before it appears physically. Now I want you to notice something important about this process. Seeing the end before it exists does not mean ignoring the steps required to get there. The path still matters. Work still needs to be done. Skills must be developed, and obstacles must be overcome. But the end result acts like a compass. It provides a direction that guides each step forward. Without that vision, people often wander from one attempt to another without clarity. They start projects but abandon them quickly because they cannot clearly see where the effort is leading. Their motivation fades because the destination is unclear. But when the end is vividly imagined, persistence becomes easier. Even when progress is slow, the individual remembers the picture they are moving toward. This is why the mind's ability to see the end is so powerful. It gives meaning to the present effort. It transforms ordinary actions into steps within a larger journey. However, many people hesitate to imagine the end of their desires because they fear disappointment. They worry that if they picture success too clearly, they might be hurt if the outcome does not appear. So they keep their expectations small and their imagination cautious. Ironically, this protective habit often prevents them from fully committing to the vision they truly want. When imagination is restricted by fear, the mind never fully explores the possibilities that could exist. The end remains vague and uncertain. But when someone allows themselves to clearly imagine the result they desire, something begins to shift internally. The mind gradually becomes comfortable with the idea of that outcome. The once distant possibility begins feeling familiar, and familiarity changes behavior. You begin making decisions that align with the vision you hold. You notice opportunities related to it. You remain persistent even when challenges appear. Step by step, the external world begins reflecting the direction your inner vision has chosen. This does not happen because imagination magically forces reality to change. It happens because imagination quietly shapes the way you move through the world. Your actions, your attention, your persistence, and your choices all begin aligning with the future you have already seen in your mind. And when enough of those choices move in the same direction, the end you imagined gradually starts taking form in the physical world. So the real question is not whether the future can change. The future is always changing. The real question is much more personal. What kind of ending are you allowing your mind to see before the story has even begun to unfold? Now we arrive at one of the most important ideas in this entire journey, an idea that sits quietly beneath everything we have been discussing so far. We have explored imagination, inner vision, and the power of seeing the end before it exists. But there is another principle working behind all of these ideas, a principle that explains why some imagined realities eventually become real while others remain distant possibilities. This principle is often called the law of assumption. At its core, The law of assumption is surprisingly simple. It suggests that whatever you consistently assume to be true about yourself and your life begins shaping the experiences you encounter. Your assumptions act like invisible instructions guiding how you interpret the world and how you respond to it. Over time, those responses begin influencing the results you see. Now notice something interesting about the word assumption. An assumption is not necessarily something you have proven. It is something you accept as true, often without realizing it. You assume the sun will rise tomorrow morning. You assume the ground will support your weight when you take a step. These assumptions operate quietly in the background of your life, yet they strongly influence how you behave. In the same way, you also carry assumptions about yourself. You have assumptions about your abilities, your worth, your opportunities, and your future. Some of these assumptions encourage confidence and growth. Others quietly create limits that you may not even notice. For example, someone may assume they are not naturally good at speaking in public. Because they hold this belief, they avoid opportunities to practice. Their avoidance prevents improvement, and the lack of improvement reinforces the original assumption. Over time, the belief becomes stronger simply because the person acted in ways that kept confirming it. Now imagine the opposite scenario. Suppose someone assumes they can gradually become a confident speaker. With that assumption in mind, they may approach opportunities differently. They might volunteer to practice, study communication skills, and continue improving despite early mistakes. Their actions begin producing progress, and the progress reinforces the original assumption. The difference between the two individuals is not necessarily talent or intelligence. The difference lies in the assumptions guiding their behavior. This is why the law of assumption is so powerful. It reveals that many of the patterns in our lives begin with the beliefs we accept about what is possible, but the principle goes deeper than simple self-confidence. Assumptions also influence the way the mind interprets events. When you believe something is likely to happen, your attention naturally begins searching for evidence that supports that belief. The brain filters information in ways that align with the assumptions you already hold. Psychologists sometimes call this confirmation bias. The mind tends to notice information that supports existing beliefs while overlooking information that contradicts them. Over time, this process strengthens the assumptions you began with. Now think about what happens when you combine this psychological tendency with the power of imagination. If someone repeatedly imagines a particular outcome and begins assuming it is possible or even likely, their attention, behavior, and persistence start aligning with that assumption. The individual may not consciously realize what is happening, but their mindset gradually influences the way they approach opportunities and challenges. They act in ways consistent with the identity they have accepted. This is why the law of assumption is closely connected to imagination. Imagination introduces new possibilities, but assumption determines whether those possibilities become part of your identity. You might imagine a successful future from time to time, but if your deeper assumption still says, "That could never happen for someone like me," the image remains weak. The mind quietly rejects it. However, when imagination is repeated often enough that the mind begins accepting the idea as plausible, something changes. The imagined reality stops feeling like a distant fantasy. It begins feeling like a natural direction for your life. At that moment, assumption begins guiding behavior. You start making decisions that align with the identity you have accepted. You pursue opportunities that once felt intimidating. You remain persistent when obstacles appear because your assumption tells you the destination is still possible. Gradually, the external world begins reflecting the internal state you have assumed. This process does not eliminate effort or difficulty. Every meaningful goal still requires learning, persistence, and adaptation. But the law of assumption explains why two people facing similar circumstances may experience very different results. One person assumes growth is possible and continues moving forward despite challenges. The other assumes progress is unlikely and gives up early. The environment may be the same, but the assumptions guiding their actions are completely different. Over time, those differences accumulate. The remarkable thing about assumptions is that they can change. While some beliefs develop slowly through past experiences, they are not permanently fixed. When someone begins repeatedly imagining a new identity and mentally experiencing it as real, the mind gradually becomes familiar with that perspective. Familiarity leads to acceptance, and once the mind begins accepting a new assumption about what is possible, the direction of behavior begins shifting accordingly. This is why the law of assumption is not just an abstract concept. It is a practical principle operating quietly in everyday life. The beliefs you accept about yourself act like a blueprint, guiding how you move through the world. So when you start becoming aware of your assumptions, you gain something incredibly valuable: the ability to question them. Because the future you experience may not simply be determined by circumstances, it may be determined by the quiet assumptions you have been carrying about yourself all along. Now that you understand the law of assumption, we can move into something even more practical and powerful. It is one thing to imagine a future you desire. It is another thing to assume it is possible. But there is a deeper step that transforms imagination and assumption into a living experience. That step is learning how to live from the desired state. Most people approach life by living from their current circumstances. They look at what exists today, and they allow those conditions to determine how they think, feel, and behave. If the present situation is difficult, they feel discouraged. If progress is slow, they feel doubtful. Their emotional state rises and falls depending on what the external world is showing them at the moment. But the principle we are exploring suggests a different approach entirely. Instead of living from your present conditions, you begin living from the state of the person you wish to become. This does not mean pretending that your current situation does not exist. It means shifting the inner position from which you view your life. Rather than identifying with the limitations of the present, you begin identifying with the qualities and mindset of the version of you that has already reached the desired outcome. Let me explain this in a very simple way. Imagine someone who wants to become physically healthy and strong. If they continue identifying themselves as someone who is weak, tired, and incapable of change, their behavior will unconsciously reflect that identity. They may skip workouts, choose unhealthy habits, and lose motivation quickly because their self-image does not support the new lifestyle. But if that same person begins identifying as someone who is becoming strong and disciplined, their daily choices begin changing. They start asking different questions. Instead of thinking, "Do I feel like exercising today?" they think, "What would a healthy and disciplined person do right now?" That shift in identity gradually changes behavior. Living from the desired state works in exactly the same way. Instead of constantly focusing on what is missing, you begin mentally stepping into the mindset of the person who already possesses what you want. Ask yourself, how would that version of you think? How would they carry themselves? How would they approach challenges? For example, someone who desires financial independence might start thinking differently about opportunities and responsibilities. Instead of approaching life with the mindset of someone trapped by circumstances, they begin thinking like someone capable of building resources and creating value. A person who wants meaningful relationships may begin living from the state of someone who already believes they are worthy of connection. Their interactions become more open and confident because their internal identity has shifted. This change happens internally first. Before circumstances reflect the transformation, the individual begins experiencing the desired identity in their imagination and emotional state. Now, here is something very important to understand. Living from the desired state does not require constant excitement or forced positivity. In fact, the most powerful form of this practice often feels calm and natural. When you truly adopt a new state of identity, it does not feel dramatic. It feels normal. Think about how you experience your current identity. You do not wake up every morning announcing to yourself who you are. You simply assume it. Your habits, decisions, and reactions naturally reflect that identity without much effort. Living from the desired state works in the same way. At first, it requires conscious practice because the identity is unfamiliar. But as you repeatedly imagine yourself from this new perspective, the state gradually becomes comfortable. You begin reacting to situations differently because the internal reference point has changed. This shift also influences how you interpret obstacles. Instead of seeing difficulties as proof that the goal is unrealistic, You start seeing them as part of the journey toward the outcome you already expect. The person who lives from the desired state does not panic when progress slows down. They remain steady because their identity is no longer tied to temporary circumstances. Think about a skilled captain steering a ship across the ocean. The waves may rise and fall, storms may appear, and the journey may take longer than expected, but the captain does not forget the destination simply because the weather changes. The course remains the same. Living from the desired state is like holding that destination in your internal compass. Every decision you make begins aligning with the person you believe yourself to be. Over time, these decisions accumulate. Small choices, repeated consistently, create new patterns of behavior, and behavior is what gradually reshapes circumstances. This is why the inner shift must come first. If you wait for the outside world to change before adjusting your identity, you may remain stuck for a very long time. But when the inner identity changes first, the actions that follow begin guiding the world toward that vision. Step by step, the external environment starts reflecting the internal transformation. You begin noticing opportunities that once seemed invisible. Your responses to challenges become more resourceful. Your confidence grows because your identity has moved beyond the limitations of the present moment. Eventually, the gap between imagination and reality becomes smaller and smaller. The person you once pictured in your mind slowly becomes the person you experience yourself to be. And this is the quiet secret behind living from the desired state. You are no longer waiting for life to confirm who you are becoming. You are allowing your inner identity to lead the way. Up to this point, you and I have walked through several powerful ideas together. We explored imagination, the invisible workshop of creation, the law of assumption, and the importance of living from the desired state. But now we arrive at something even deeper, something that quietly determines whether all of those principles remain interesting concepts or become real forces in your life. That element is feeling. In the teachings of Neville Goddard, feeling is often described as the secret of manifestation, and once you understand why, everything you have learned so far begins to connect in a completely new way. Most people believe that change begins with thinking. They believe if they repeat positive thoughts often enough, their life will eventually improve. But thinking alone rarely produces lasting transformation. Thoughts are like instructions written on paper, but feelings are what give those instructions power. Feeling is what convinces the deeper layers of the mind that something is real. Let me show you what I mean. Think about a memory from your past that was emotionally powerful. Perhaps it was a moment of joy, success, embarrassment, or heartbreak. When you remember it now, something interesting happens. Your mind does not simply recall the facts of the event. It recreates the emotional atmosphere of the experience. In some cases, you can almost feel the moment again, even though it happened years ago. That emotional response occurs because the mind treats feeling as evidence of reality. The stronger the emotion attached to an experience, the more vividly the mind records it. Feeling leaves an imprint. Now imagine applying that same principle to something that has not yet happened. When you imagine a desired outcome but feel nothing while doing so, the mind treats the image like a passing thought. It appears briefly and then disappears. But when you imagine an experience and allow yourself to feel what it would be like if it were real, the mind responds very differently. Suddenly, the image becomes alive. You are no longer observing the idea from a distance. You are participating in it emotionally. The mind begins interpreting that emotional experience as something meaningful and significant. This is why feeling is the bridge between imagination and reality. Imagination provides the picture, but feeling provides the life within that picture. Without feeling, imagination remains faint and uncertain. With feeling, the imagined experience begins influencing the deeper patterns of the mind. Think about an actor preparing for an important role. The actor does not simply memorize lines. They immerse themselves in the emotional world of the character. They imagine how the character feels, reacts, and thinks in different situations. Eventually, the performance stops looking like imitation and starts looking like genuine expression. The actor feels the role from the inside. Creation works in a similar way. When you imagine a future and allow yourself to feel it internally, you begin rehearsing the emotional state of the person who is already living that reality. And that emotional rehearsal gradually changes your identity. Now, this does not mean you must generate intense excitement every time you imagine your goal. In fact, the most powerful feeling is often quiet certainty. It is the calm sense that something already belongs to you internally, even if the physical evidence has not yet appeared. Imagine someone who desires financial freedom. If they imagine wealth while feeling anxious, doubtful, or desperate, the emotional message being sent to the mind is still one of lack. But if they imagine prosperity with a sense of calm, confidence, and gratitude, the emotional tone is completely different. The mind begins associating abundance with a natural and believable state. Feeling shifts the internal atmosphere, and atmosphere matters because the mind tends to move toward emotional states that feel familiar. When a particular feeling is repeated often enough, the mind begins accepting it as part of your identity. This is why many people unknowingly reinforce negative patterns in their lives. They repeatedly imagine worst-case scenarios while feeling fear or frustration. Over time, those emotional states become familiar. The mind begins expecting experiences that match them. But the same principle can work in a constructive direction as well. When you deliberately imagine a desired outcome and allow yourself to feel the satisfaction, peace, or confidence associated with it, you begin building a new emotional pattern. The mind gradually becomes comfortable with that state. At first, it may feel unfamiliar, even slightly unrealistic, but each time you return to the feeling, the experience becomes more natural. The emotional state begins influencing how you carry yourself in daily life. Your posture changes, your tone of voice changes, your responses to challenges become more steady. You start making decisions from a place of confidence rather than hesitation. Step by step, your behavior begins reflecting the emotional identity you have rehearsed internally. And as behavior changes, circumstances often begin shifting as well. This is why feeling is so central to the creative process. It is not simply a reaction to events that have already happened. It is part of the mechanism through which new experiences begin forming. Your imagination shows the mind what is possible. Your assumptions define what you believe is likely, but your feelings determine what the mind accepts as real. Once an imagined experience feels real enough inside you, your perception of the world begins changing. Opportunities that once seemed invisible become noticeable. Challenges that once seemed overwhelming begin appearing manageable. You move differently through life because the emotional state guiding your actions has changed. And this is the quiet secret behind manifestation. It is not about forcing reality to change through sheer willpower. It is about allowing your inner emotional world to experience the desired reality so vividly that your mind begins organizing your life around it. Because the moment your imagination and your feelings begin speaking the same language, something powerful happens. The future you once hoped for no longer feels like a distant possibility. It starts feeling like something that already belongs to you. Now that you understand the role of imagination, assumption, identity, and feeling, the next question becomes very practical. How do you actually apply these ideas in your daily life? It is one thing to understand the principles intellectually, but it is another thing entirely to turn them into a living practice. Neville Goddard often emphasized that imagination becomes most powerful when it is used in a quiet and deliberate way, especially during a very particular moment of the day, the moment just before sleep. I want you to notice something about that time of night when your day is ending and your body begins to relax. Your mind gradually moves into a softer state of awareness. The noise of the day fades. The tension in your muscles begins to release, and your thoughts become slower and more fluid. This transition between waking and sleep is one of the most unique states of consciousness you experience every day. In this state, the mind becomes especially receptive to images and feelings. Think about how dreams begin. You do not force them. They appear naturally when the mind is relaxed and open. The imagination becomes active, while the logical, analytical part of the mind becomes quieter. In this condition, the boundary between imagination and experience becomes thinner. That is why the moments before sleep are so valuable for imaginative creation. During the day, your attention is constantly pulled outward by responsibilities, conversations, and distractions. Your thoughts jump rapidly from one subject to another. But at night, as your body prepares for sleep, your mind becomes calmer. This is the moment when imagination can operate with unusual clarity. Instead of allowing your thoughts to wander randomly during this time, you can gently guide them. Imagine the outcome you desire as though it has already happened, not tomorrow, not someday in the future, but now. Picture a short scene that would naturally occur if your goal were already fulfilled. It does not need to be complicated. In fact, the simpler the scene, the easier it is for the mind to accept. For example, if your desire involves career success, you might imagine a friend congratulating you. If your goal involves personal growth, you might imagine yourself confidently handling a situation that once felt difficult. If your desire involves improved relationships, you might imagine a moment of genuine connection and warmth. The key is to choose a scene that implies the wish has already been fulfilled. Now, here is the most important part of the practice. Do not watch the scene like a movie playing in front of you. Instead, experience it from within. See the environment through your own eyes. Hear the voices. Feel the atmosphere. Notice the details. Allow yourself to feel what the moment would be like if it were actually happening. This feeling is what gives the imagined experience life. Repeat the scene gently, allowing it to unfold again and again in your imagination. There is no need to strain or force anything. The goal is not intense concentration but relaxed participation. Let the experience feel natural, almost like remembering something pleasant that has already happened. As you continue replaying the scene, your body will gradually become more relaxed. Your breathing will slow. Eventually sleep will arrive. And this is where something subtle but powerful occurs. The last impression held in the mind before sleep often lingers beneath the surface of consciousness during the night. The emotional tone of that impression can influence the deeper patterns of thought that guide your behavior and perception the following day. In other words, the mind carries the feeling of the imagined experience into the subconscious layers of awareness. Over time, repeating this nightly practice strengthens the connection between your desired identity and your internal emotional state. The vision becomes familiar. The mind begins accepting it as something natural rather than distant. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. You do not need to perform this practice perfectly. Even a few minutes each night can gradually reshape the mental atmosphere in which your thoughts operate. The key is returning to the experience often enough that it becomes a normal part of your inner world. At first, the images may feel faint or slightly artificial. That is completely natural. The mind is simply becoming accustomed to a new pattern. But as the practice continues, the scenes often become clearer and the emotional response becomes stronger. Something inside you begins adjusting to the idea that the imagined reality is possible, and when the mind becomes comfortable with that idea, behavior begins changing in subtle ways. Your reactions to challenges become calmer. Your attention shifts toward opportunities that align with your vision. You begin carrying yourself with the quiet confidence of someone moving toward a meaningful destination. Step by step, the gap between imagination and experience begins to narrow. The world outside may not change overnight, but the world inside you does. And that inner shift gradually influences the choices you make, the actions you take, and the direction your life moves. This is why the nightly practice of imaginative creation is so powerful. It uses a natural moment in the rhythm of your day, a moment when the mind is already open to imagery and feeling. Instead of allowing random thoughts to fill that space, you deliberately plant the image of the reality you wish to experience. Night after night, the same seed is placed gently into the soil of the mind. And just like any seed placed in fertile ground, once it is planted often enough, something begins to grow quietly beneath the surface, long before the first visible signs of change appear in the world around you. By now, you and I have explored many powerful ideas together. You understand the invisible workshop of imagination, the law of assumption, the importance of feeling, and the practice of living from the desired state. You have also learned about the nightly practice of imaginative creation. And yet, there is an honest question that must be asked at this point. If these principles are so powerful, why do so many people fail to see results? It is a fair question. Many people read about manifestation, try it for a short time, and then quietly conclude that it does not work. They may imagine their desires for a few days or repeat positive thoughts for a while, But when the physical world does not immediately change, they abandon the practice. From their perspective, the method seems ineffective. But when you look carefully at what usually happens, the issue is rarely the principle itself. The issue is how the principle is applied. Most people do not fail because the process is impossible. They fail because their inner habits continue working against the change they are trying to create. Let us examine some of the most common patterns that interrupt the process. The first is inconsistency. Many people imagine their desired outcome for a few minutes, perhaps with excitement and hope, but the rest of their day is filled with thoughts that contradict the vision. They return to worry, frustration, and doubt the moment they encounter difficulties. In effect, the mind receives two completely different instructions. For a few moments they imagine success, but for the majority of the day they rehearse failure. When the mind receives conflicting signals, the stronger and more frequent pattern usually wins, and in most cases, the familiar pattern of doubt has been repeated for years. A few moments of imagination cannot easily overcome years of habitual thinking. Consistency is what allows a new mental pattern to become dominant. The second challenge is impatience. Modern culture trains us to expect immediate results. When we use a device, we expect instant responses. When we order something online, we expect rapid delivery. But the process of internal change rarely operates on that timeline. Imagination begins shaping the inner state first. Identity begins shifting. Behavior gradually follows. Only then do circumstances begin responding to the new direction of action. This sequence often requires time, but many people abandon the process before the internal transformation has a chance to influence the external world. They check their circumstances too frequently, looking for confirmation that the method is working. Ironically, that constant checking often reinforces the feeling that the desired reality has not yet appeared. The third obstacle is emotional contradiction. As we discussed earlier, feeling is the secret of manifestation, yet many people attempt to imagine their desires while still feeling deeply attached to the emotions of lack. For example, someone may imagine financial success while feeling anxious about money. They picture abundance while simultaneously worrying about scarcity. The emotional signal being sent to the mind remains confused. The mind responds more strongly to feeling than to words or images. If the emotional tone contradicts the imagined outcome, the deeper layers of the mind continue reinforcing the old pattern. This is why calm confidence is often more powerful than intense excitement. Genuine emotional alignment matters more than forced positivity. Another common reason people struggle is that they treat manifestation like a technique rather than a transformation of identity. They imagine specific outcomes but never allow themselves to become the type of person who naturally experiences those outcomes. For example, someone might imagine becoming successful while still identifying themselves as someone who is unlucky or incapable. The desired event is imagined, but the self-image remains unchanged. In that situation, the mind quietly resists the vision because it conflicts with the identity the person has accepted. Real transformation happens when imagination reshapes the way you see yourself. This is why living from the desired state is so important. The goal is not simply to visualize a new result, but to adopt the perspective of the person who naturally produces that result. Another subtle challenge involves attention. Many people attempt to control their thoughts directly, trying to force themselves to avoid any negative thinking. This approach often backfires because the mind resists excessive control. A more effective approach is gently redirecting attention. Instead of fighting every negative thought, you repeatedly return to the vision you prefer. Over time, the preferred image becomes more familiar, and the unwanted patterns gradually lose their influence. Transformation rarely happens through force. It happens through repetition and familiarity. And finally, one of the most overlooked reasons people fail to manifest is that they stop too soon. The process of internal change can be quiet and gradual. You may not immediately notice the subtle shifts happening in your perception, behavior, and confidence, but those small shifts accumulate. A different choice here, a new opportunity noticed there, a slightly more confident response in a situation that once caused hesitation. These small adjustments gradually move your life in a new direction. From the outside, The change may appear sudden when it finally becomes visible, but from the inside, it was the result of many small internal shifts happening over time. This is why persistence matters more than perfection. You do not need to imagine flawlessly every day. You simply need to continue returning to the state you wish to experience. Every time you revisit the vision with feeling and acceptance, you strengthen the new pattern. And once that pattern becomes stronger than the old one, the direction of your life begins changing almost naturally. So when people say manifestation does not work, they are often observing something real, but they are observing the moment before the process has had enough time to unfold. Because the truth is this: imagination, assumption, and feeling are always shaping your experience, whether you use them consciously or not. The only real question is whether you will remain patient long enough to allow the new reality you are building inside your mind to finally appear in the world around you. At this point in our journey, you already understand something most people never fully realize. Your imagination is not just a place for random thoughts. It is the workshop where your future quietly begins to take shape. You have seen how assumptions influence behavior, how feeling gives life to imagination, and how living from the desired state gradually reshapes identity. But there is one ingredient that determines whether all of this becomes a lasting transformation or fades away like a passing idea. That ingredient is persistence, mental persistence. Let me speak to you very directly about this, because it is where many people quietly lose momentum. It is easy to feel inspired for a short time. When you first discover these ideas, the mind becomes excited. You begin imagining new possibilities, picturing the life you want, and feeling hopeful about the future. But after a few days or weeks, the familiar patterns of daily life begin to return. Old doubts reappear. External circumstances may not change as quickly as you expected. Slowly, the new vision begins to fade. This is where mental discipline becomes essential. Persistence does not mean forcing yourself to feel excited every moment of the day. It does not mean constantly repeating affirmations or trying to suppress every negative thought. True persistence is quieter than that. It is the calm decision to return again and again to the state you have chosen, even when your surroundings have not yet caught up with it. Think of a gardener planting seeds in the soil. The gardener does not dig up the seeds every day to check whether they are growing. That would only interrupt the process. Instead, they water the soil, protect the environment, and trust that something is developing beneath the surface. Mental persistence works the same way. When you imagine a new identity or a desired outcome, you are planting a seed in the invisible workshop of your mind. At first, there may be no visible evidence that anything has changed. The external world may look exactly the same, but the inner pattern has already begun forming. If you constantly abandon the new state the moment circumstances look difficult, the seed never has time to grow. The mind simply returns to the familiar identity it has practiced for years. But when you persist, when you repeatedly return to the feeling of the desired state, the new pattern gradually becomes stronger. Now, I want you to notice something very important about persistence. It is not about perfection. You will not maintain a perfect mental state every hour of every day. Doubts will appear. Frustrations will arise. Old habits of thinking will occasionally return. This is completely natural. The difference between someone who succeeds and someone who gives up is not that one person never experiences doubt. The difference is that one person returns to the chosen state more quickly. Persistence is the ability to redirect your attention. When the mind drifts toward fear or limitation, you gently guide it back to the vision you have accepted, not through force or frustration, but through calm repetition. Each time you return to the desired state, you reinforce the new identity. Over time, this repetition changes something fundamental within you. The imagined reality begins feeling familiar, and familiarity is powerful. The mind naturally moves towards states that feel normal. When a new state has been rehearsed often enough in imagination and feeling, it gradually becomes part of your sense of self. You begin reacting to life from that new identity without needing to consciously think about it. Your decisions shift. Your responses to challenges change. Opportunities that once seemed intimidating begin appearing manageable. The person you imagined yourself becoming starts emerging through your actions. From the outside, it may appear that circumstances suddenly changed in your favor. But from the inside, you know something else happened first. Your inner state changed long before the external results appeared. This is why persistence is the bridge between imagination and reality. Many people imagine their desires briefly but then abandon the state when they encounter obstacles. They treat difficulties as proof that their vision was unrealistic. But those who understand the creative process view obstacles differently. They see them as temporary conditions that have not yet caught up with the new direction of their life. Instead of reacting emotionally to every fluctuation in circumstances, they remain steady in their chosen identity. They continue imagining the end. They continue feeling the state of the person they intend to become. And gradually, the world begins adjusting around that stability. You see, the mind is always practicing something. Every day you rehearse thoughts, emotions, and reactions that reinforce a particular identity. If you repeatedly rehearse limitation, limitation becomes familiar. If you repeatedly rehearse growth, growth becomes familiar. Persistence determines which pattern becomes dominant. This is why discipline of the mind matters so much. It is not about controlling every thought. It is about choosing which mental state you return to most often. The state you revisit consistently becomes the foundation of your identity. And once identity changes, behavior follows naturally. Actions begin aligning with the person you believe yourself to be. Step by step, your life begins reflecting the inner pattern you have practiced. So when people ask why persistence is necessary, the answer is simple. The mind becomes what it repeatedly experiences. If you want a new reality to appear in your life, the new identity must become familiar enough that your mind accepts it as normal. And that familiarity is created through one quiet but powerful habit, the discipline of returning, again and again, to the future you have already chosen to see. At this stage in our journey together, you have already discovered something that many people spend their entire lives overlooking. You have seen how imagination shapes the direction of experience, how assumptions guide behavior, and how persistence gradually transforms identity. But now I want to talk to you about something even more subtle, something that quietly operates beneath all of these principles. It is the story you tell yourself about who you are. Every person carries an inner narrative. It is a collection of memories, interpretations, and beliefs that form the identity you live from every day. Most of the time, this story runs automatically. You rarely stop to question it. It feels familiar, almost like a voice that has been speaking in your mind for as long as you can remember. This inner story explains your past, defines your present, and predicts your future. For example, someone might carry a story that says, "I've always struggled with money." Another person might repeat a story like, "I'm just not confident around people." Someone else may believe, "Opportunities never seem to work out for me." These stories often sound harmless, even honest. They appear to describe reality as it has been experienced so far. But what many people fail to notice is that the mind treats these repeated narratives as instructions. The more often the story is told, the more deeply the identity becomes rooted. Eventually, the story stops feeling like an interpretation of events. It begins feeling like a permanent truth. Once that happens, the mind starts organizing behavior around that narrative. The person who believes they struggle with money may unknowingly make cautious decisions that limit opportunity. The individual who believes they lack confidence may avoid situations that could help them grow. The person who expects disappointment may approach new experiences with hesitation. In each case, the story quietly shapes the direction of action. But here is something remarkable that many people never realize. The inner story is not fixed. It is not an unchangeable record of reality. It is a narrative constructed by the mind through repeated interpretation. And what the mind creates through repetition can also be rewritten through repetition. Think about a writer working on a novel. At any moment, the author can revise a chapter, change the direction of a character, or rewrite the ending entirely. The story evolves as the writer continues shaping it. In the same way, the story you carry about yourself can change when you begin consciously choosing a new narrative. Now, this does not mean denying your past or pretending certain experiences never happened. Your life history remains part of who you are. But the meaning you assign to those experiences is not permanent. You can reinterpret your past in ways that empower rather than limit you. For example, someone who once struggled with failure might tell themselves a story of defeat. They might repeat the idea that they are unlucky or incapable. But the same experiences could also be interpreted differently. They could become evidence of resilience, learning, and growth. The events remain the same. The meaning changes, and meaning influences identity. When you begin rewriting your inner story, imagination becomes one of your most valuable tools. You start imagining yourself from a new perspective. Instead of reinforcing the identity shaped by old experiences, you begin exploring the identity of the person you are becoming. What kind of person handles challenges with confidence? What kind of person builds meaningful success? What kind of person creates the life you desire? These questions invite your imagination to explore a different narrative. At first, the new story may feel unfamiliar. The mind naturally returns to the old version because it has been repeated for years. But each time you consciously choose the new narrative, you strengthen it. This process works very much like the persistence we discussed earlier. The story you repeat most often becomes the one the mind accepts. Imagine someone who begins telling a new inner story. I am learning to trust my abilities. Or, I am becoming someone who creates opportunities. Or even, my past prepared me for the future I am building now. Each of these statements introduces a new direction for identity. Over time, as the story becomes familiar, behavior begins aligning with it. The person starts taking actions that support the new narrative. Confidence grows. Curiosity replaces fear. Decisions begin reflecting the identity the mind has accepted. Gradually, the external world begins reflecting the new story. This transformation rarely happens through a single dramatic moment. Instead, it unfolds through small shifts in perception and behavior. A different response to a challenge, a new willingness to try something unfamiliar, a quiet confidence in situations that once created hesitation. These changes accumulate, and one day, the person realizes that the story they used to believe about themselves no longer feels true. They have become someone different. This is why rewriting the inner story is such a powerful step in the creative process. Your imagination is not only shaping future possibilities, it is also reshaping the way you understand yourself. When the narrative changes, identity begins evolving, and when identity evolves, life begins moving in a new direction. So, I want you to pause for a moment and consider something very carefully. The story you have been repeating about your life may feel permanent, but it is still a story. And the moment you begin choosing a different narrative, one that reflects the person you are becoming rather than the person you once believed you were, you discover something remarkable. You were never trapped inside the old story. You were simply repeating it. Up until now, you and I have explored a powerful sequence of ideas. You have seen how imagination creates inner images, how assumptions shape expectations, how feelings bring those images to life, and how persistence allows a new identity to take root. But there is one final shift that turns all of these ideas into a living reality. It is the moment when you stop chasing what you want and begin becoming the person who already has it. Most people spend their lives pursuing desires from a position of distance. They see what they want somewhere in the future, somewhere ahead of them. They think in terms like one day, someday, or when things finally change. In this mindset, the desired life always feels slightly out of reach. The individual remains someone who is trying to get there. But the principle we are exploring suggests something different. Instead of continuously reaching for the desired outcome, you begin identifying as the person who already embodies it internally. You step into the identity first. This shift might seem subtle, but it changes everything. Imagine someone who wants to become confident. If they constantly think of themselves as a person who lacks confidence, every situation will reinforce that belief. Even when they attempt to act differently, the old identity quietly pulls them back. But when someone begins identifying as a person who is developing confidence, their perspective changes. Instead of asking, "How can I avoid embarrassment?" they begin asking, "How would a confident person respond in this situation?" That question alone can transform behavior. The same principle applies to any goal. Someone who desires success begins thinking like someone who creates value. Someone who desires meaningful relationships begins acting like someone who believes they deserve connection. Someone who desires growth begins approaching challenges like someone who expects to learn and improve. In each case, the identity shifts before the circumstances fully change. Now let me clarify something important. Becoming the person who already has it does not mean pretending the physical result has already appeared. It means adopting the internal qualities that naturally belong to that version of yourself. Think about the difference between wanting wealth and becoming someone who thinks like a builder of wealth. The first position focuses on the outcome alone. The second focuses on the mindset, habits, and attitudes that produce the outcome. When identity changes, behavior follows naturally. Consider an athlete preparing for competition. The athlete does not constantly think about whether they deserve to win. They train, practice, and think like someone who belongs in the arena. Their identity is aligned with the role they are playing. Because of that alignment, their actions become consistent and focused. The same pattern appears in personal transformation. When you begin identifying with the person you intend to become, your decisions gradually start reflecting that identity. You begin choosing habits that support the new version of yourself. You become more attentive to opportunities that align with your direction. You respond to setbacks with resilience instead of discouragement. Over time, these small shifts accumulate. At first, the change may feel subtle. The world around you might not immediately look different, but something inside you has already begun moving in a new direction. Your internal compass has shifted. This is why identity is such a powerful force in shaping experience. People rarely act consistently against the identity they believe about themselves. If someone believes they are disciplined, they naturally behave in disciplined ways. If someone believes they are capable of growth, they continue learning even when progress is slow. Identity influences behavior far more deeply than temporary motivation. And this is why imagination plays such a crucial role in transformation. Imagination allows you to mentally experience the identity you want to adopt before it becomes fully visible in your life. You begin seeing yourself from a different perspective. When you imagine your future self clearly enough, you start understanding how that person thinks, speaks, and moves through the world. The more familiar that perspective becomes, the more natural it feels. Eventually, the gap between imagination and behavior begins closing. You start acting from the identity you once only imagined. This does not happen through force or constant self-correction. It happens because the new identity becomes familiar enough that it begins guiding your reactions automatically. And when identity changes, life begins rearranging around that shift. Your choices align with your vision. Your persistence strengthens because you no longer see yourself as someone struggling toward the goal. You see yourself as someone growing into it. This quiet transformation is often the moment when everything starts moving more smoothly. Opportunities appear that once seemed invisible. Conversations unfold differently. Challenges no longer feel like proof of failure, but simply part of the process. From the outside, it may look like luck or coincidence, but from the inside, you know something deeper has happened. You stopped waiting for the world to give you permission to become who you wanted to be. Instead, you stepped into that identity first. And the moment you begin living as the person who already embodies the qualities you seek, the distance between desire and reality becomes much smaller than you ever imagined. Now, I want you to consider one of the most profound ideas in this entire journey, an idea that may change the way you interpret almost every experience in your life. It is the idea that the world you encounter is, in many ways, a mirror of consciousness. This does not mean that every event is directly controlled by your thoughts, nor does it suggest that you personally create every circumstance that appears around you. What it suggests is something subtler but incredibly powerful. The state of consciousness you consistently live in influences how reality unfolds around you. Think about a mirror for a moment. A mirror does not create the image it reflects. It simply reveals what stands before it. If you stand in front of the mirror, smiling, the reflection smiles back. If you appear tense or worried, the reflection shows the same expression. The mirror does not argue with the image. It simply responds. In many ways, your experience of life behaves similarly. The world around you often reflects the state you carry within. Your expectations, assumptions, emotional patterns, and identity quietly influence the experiences you encounter. The reflection may not appear instantly, but over time the patterns within your consciousness begin shaping the patterns in your life. Let me explain this in a practical way. Imagine two people walking into the same room, filled with strangers. One person enters with the assumption that people are generally friendly and open. The other enters believing that most people are judgmental and distant. They are standing in the same environment, yet their experiences will likely be very different. The first person may smile, start conversations, and notice welcoming responses from others. The second person may appear guarded, avoid interaction, and notice subtle signs that confirm their suspicion that people are unfriendly. Both individuals interpret the same environment through the lens of their expectations. Their internal state influences how they behave, and their behavior influences how others respond. The world begins reflecting the consciousness they bring into the situation. Now expand this idea beyond a single moment and imagine it operating across the patterns of your life. The assumptions you carry about opportunity, relationships, success, and personal growth gradually shape how you approach situations. They influence the risks you take, the connections you build, and the persistence you maintain when challenges arise. Over time, those choices begin shaping the results you experience. This is why the concept of consciousness as a mirror becomes so powerful. It invites you to look inward before blaming or praising the outer world. Instead of asking only, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin asking a different question. What state of consciousness am I bringing into this situation? This shift does not mean you ignore external factors or deny the complexity of life. Circumstances can be influenced by many forces beyond your control, but even within those circumstances, your internal state still plays a significant role in how you navigate them. Your consciousness influences the direction you move, the meaning you assign to events, and the possibilities you recognize. Think about how two people can experience the same challenge yet respond in completely different ways. One person may interpret the challenge as proof that success is impossible. Another may interpret it as an opportunity to learn and adapt. The situation itself remains the same, but the consciousness interpreting it is different. Over time, these differences accumulate. The person who sees opportunity within difficulty continues experimenting and growing. The person who sees only limitation gradually withdraws from possibility. The mirror of life reflects those inner orientations. This is why the work you do within your imagination and identity matters so much. When you change your internal state, your assumptions, your expectations, your emotional patterns, you begin altering the image that the mirror reflects. The world starts responding differently because you are moving through it differently. You notice possibilities that once seemed invisible. You approach conversations with confidence rather than hesitation. You persist through obstacles with a mindset that expects progress rather than defeat. These shifts may appear small in the beginning, but they gradually reshape the trajectory of your experiences. Think of consciousness like the atmosphere surrounding your life. Just as weather conditions influence the environment around them, your internal atmosphere influences the way situations unfold. If the atmosphere is filled with doubt, frustration, and limitation, the experiences you encounter often reinforce those states. But when the atmosphere becomes filled with clarity, confidence, and expectation, the world begins responding to that new condition. You begin attracting different opportunities, different conversations, and different outcomes. This does not happen because the universe suddenly changes its rules. It happens because your consciousness has shifted the way you interact with reality, and reality responds. The mirror begins showing a different reflection. This understanding carries a quiet responsibility. It reminds you that the work of transformation begins within. Instead of constantly trying to force external circumstances to change, you begin shaping the state of consciousness that interacts with those circumstances. You cultivate the identity of the person you wish to become. You practice seeing the end in your imagination. You persist in the feeling of the desired state. Gradually, your internal world becomes aligned with the reality you want to experience. And when that alignment becomes strong enough, the reflection in the mirror of life begins changing as well. Because the world you see around you is not just a stage where events randomly unfold. In many ways, It is a reflection quietly responding to the consciousness you bring into it every single day. Now we arrive at the final step of this journey, and perhaps the most important realization of all. Everything we have explored together, the invisible workshop of imagination, the law of assumption, the power of feeling, the discipline of persistence, the rewriting of your inner story, and the understanding that the world reflects your consciousness, leads to one simple but profound conclusion. There is a creative power within you that most people never fully awaken. Throughout life, many individuals move through the world believing they are merely reacting to circumstances. They believe that reality is something fixed, something that happens to them rather than something they participate in shaping. When situations become difficult, they assume their options are limited. When opportunities appear, they may doubt whether they deserve them. In this way, they quietly surrender their creative power without realizing it. But the ideas we have explored together reveal something very different. Your imagination is not an accidental feature of the mind. It is the doorway through which possibility enters your life. Your assumptions are not passive thoughts. They are the framework through which your experiences take shape. Your feelings are not random reactions. They are signals that tell the deeper layers of your mind what reality you are preparing to live in. Once you understand this, something begins to shift inside you. You realize that your inner life matters far more than you once believed. Every thought you repeat, every identity you accept, every story you tell yourself about your future quietly shapes the direction of your actions, and those actions gradually influence the world around you. This is the creative power within you. Now, awakening this power does not mean controlling every event in life. The world remains complex and full of variables. Challenges will still appear. Uncertainty will still exist. But awakening the creative power within you means recognizing that you are not helpless within those circumstances. You have the ability to choose the state of consciousness from which you respond to life. When difficulties arise, you can return to the identity you are building. When doubts appear, you can guide your imagination back toward the vision you have accepted. When old patterns of thinking try to pull you backward, you can persist in the new story you have chosen. This quiet practice gradually strengthens the creative power inside you. Imagine someone who once believed their life was defined by limitations. They may have repeated the same doubts for years, but the moment they begin practicing these principles, something subtle begins changing. They start imagining possibilities they once dismissed. They begin feeling the emotional state of the person they are becoming. They persist in that identity even when circumstances have not yet changed. Day by day, the inner atmosphere begins shifting, and with that shift comes new perception. Opportunities that once seemed invisible become noticeable. Conversations unfold differently. Confidence begins replacing hesitation. The person moves through life with a different posture, a different tone, a different energy. From the outside, others may describe this change as luck, timing, or coincidence. But you and I know something deeper is happening. The individual has awakened the creative power that was always present within them. This awakening rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment. It usually unfolds gradually. One new thought replaces an old assumption. One small act of persistence strengthens a new identity. One imagined vision becomes familiar enough to guide real-world decisions, and over time, these small shifts accumulate into a completely different life experience. The person who once reacted to circumstances begins shaping them. This is the quiet transformation at the heart of Neville Goddard's teaching. The goal is not to escape reality. The goal is to recognize your role within it. You are not merely watching the story of your life unfold, you are participating in the writing of it. Your imagination sketches the direction, your assumptions give the sketch structure, your feelings bring the image to life. Your persistence allows the vision to stabilize until it becomes part of your identity, and identity shapes the choices that build your future. So, as we reach the end of this journey together, I want you to pause and consider something very carefully. The ideas we have explored are not distant philosophies meant only for reflection. They are practical tools that can be applied in the quiet moments of your daily life. Each night, before you sleep, you can return to the vision you wish to experience. Each day, you can choose the identity you are growing into. Each moment, You can guide the direction of your imagination. These small choices awaken the creative power within you, and once that power is awake, you begin seeing the world differently. Life stops looking like a rigid structure that controls your destiny. Instead, it begins looking like a canvas, one that responds gradually to the images you hold within your consciousness. You realize that the future is not something waiting for you somewhere far away. It is something quietly taking shape inside your imagination right now. And the moment you truly understand that, you recognize the most important truth of all. The creative power you were searching for was never outside you. It has been within you the entire time, waiting for you to finally awaken it.